Good day. Today is a day which in much of the former Eastern Bloc, including Russia and I believe still in Ukraine, is celebrated as the May Day holiday. It is, by the way, also celebrated. The May Day holiday is also celebrated in Britain, where it is called, somewhat strangely, a bank holiday. I'm not sure why banks are entitled to holidays but not other people, but anyway, it is a public holiday in Britain. So may I take this first opportunity to wish all of you who are celebrating this holiday today, May Day or the May holiday, a very happy holiday today. It's a nice holiday in spring, or at least I always feel so. But of course, the fact that we have a holiday at this time, celebrated particularly in the areas where the current crisis, the crisis over and around Ukraine, has its epicenter, does mean that in some ways one is getting rather less news than one would perhaps like, at least on the battlefields. So I'm not able to provide you with a precise update on military developments, and as I've discussed, I'm not anyway perhaps the best person to be doing that. If you want to find somebody who's really up to date on these sort of things and who speaks the various languages, well, again, I would refer to Jacob Dryson and the Dryson Report, which always provides up to date and, as far as I can see, extremely accurate and well thought out analytical pieces on what is actually going on in the various battlefields. For what it's worth, Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen government, which is of course a government within Russia and who's a lieutenant general in the Russian armed forces, reports that he thinks that the Battle of Popasnaya, the importance of which I touched on yesterday in my video, is now winding towards its close, that Popasnaya will soon fall to the Russians and their allied troops. I would say that in Popasnaya, as far as I can see, the fighting is almost exclusively carried out by the Donbass militia, the militia of the Donetsk People's Republics. There's also Chechen troops there, who presumably serve as part of the Russian National Guard, but who have their own chain of command that reaches all the way back to Kadyrov. And there's also Russian mercenaries from this rather unsavory organization, at least unsavory as far as I'm concerned, which is the Wagner Group. So as far as I am aware, the actual Russian military is not physically present in the fighting in Popasnaya. But indeed, if Popasnaya is soon captured by the Russian allied troops, then that will be apparently a significant victory for the Russians and their allies in the fighting in the Donbass. Now, I would say that Kadyrov, in my experience, does tend to be somewhat ahead of the curve in announcing that various places have been captured or have fallen. But usually, when he says that something is about to happen, it does eventually happen, though not perhaps quite as quickly as he predicts. So, for example, he was one of the first to say that the fighting in Mariupol was winding towards an end, and he was eventually proved right about that. He was also the first person, to my knowledge, to report the capture of the town of Rubizhnoye, and another important place. And it is indeed the case, apparently, that the Russians and their allied troops now have complete control of the residential areas of that town, though there are still Ukrainians hanging on in some of the industrial areas in the outskirts of this city. And so that gives one reason to believe that Kadyrov's predictions about Popasnaya are likely to be true. Well, I'm not going to discuss further the importance of Popasnaya to the battle. I touched on what others say about it in my long video yesterday. As I said, I'm hardly the right person to discuss these kind of things in detail. If If you want, as I said, to find somebody who understands these things, then Jacob Dryson is a good place to go to. Though, of course, you can also access various Russian sites as well, some of which you can still find on the internet and which do provide a Russian perspective on the battle. The Ukrainians also, do provide quite a lot of information about what is going on. But I have to say this, and as the Ghost of Kiev debacle has now shown, what the Ukrainians say is not always reliable. I would add that a lot of Western media have been very embarrassed by the Ghost of Kiev episode. I read in the British media a really strange article about the Ukrainian admission that the Ghost of Kiev, this famed fighter pilot who shot down single-handed 40 Russian aircraft, that this individual is a fiction. There was a long explanation of why the Ukrainians were entirely justified and did fully the right thing to create this myth around the Ghost of Kiev, that it was all necessary in the early days of the war when things seemed to be going badly for Ukraine, and that engaging in this kind of propaganda was necessary to sustain morale. All of which arguably is true, but of course it doesn't justify or explain why so many Western media outlets took the whole Ghost of Kiev story as true and continued to run for it weeks after the Ukrainians themselves had gradually dialed down on it. I would add, by the way, if we're talking about myths, that the myth of the heroic stand by the Ukrainian troops on Snake Island, also at the start of the war, is also one that Westerners seem to be obsessed with sticking with. This is the original story, was that a small group of Ukrainian soldiers replied with some kind of obscenity when the Russians called on them to surrender, and then they went on fighting to the last man. And in fact, that story was proved to be false almost immediately when the Russians produced pictures showing that all of these men had in fact surrendered. But nonetheless, the West still persists in repeating this story, focusing now on this alleged obscenity which these Ukrainian soldiers supposedly sent, even though whether they did send an obscenity like that is unknown to me. And besides, the point of their doing so seems to me to have gone, given that they did surrender after all. But there we go. That's one reason why I am more careful in taking information from Ukraine. I would say that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians provide a great deal of information about what is going on the actual battlefronts. The Russians do provide a detailed running account of their missile and aerial strikes across Ukraine, and that is extremely useful and instructive, and it is corroborated to a great extent by information on the ground and information, by the way, from Ukrainian sources. So that part of the information which the Russians provide, which comes, by the way, from the Russian Defense Ministry, is reliable and can be treated securely. Pretty much everything else that comes has to be taken sometimes with a pinch of salt, though I would say that generally and overall the picture that we're getting from Russian sources, and these are informal sources, tends to be, in my experience, reasonably accurate about the evolving situation. And as I said, it does seem as if Popasnaya is apparently moving towards capture by the Russian allied troops, and the town of Liman, which is on the way to Slavyansk, where the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian forces are trying to dig in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. That also seems to have been encircled, and there are reports that it too is about to fall to the Russians and their allied forces. And Arestovich, who is one of President Zelensky's advisors and his PR mastermind, he has essentially admitted that it is now only a question of time before Ukrainian troops in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are entirely encircled. I mean, physically encircled. And when that happens, I would have thought that their collapse is only a matter of time, though how much time, I'm not going to try to guess. Speaking of which, that brings me to that other great encirclement which has happened in another part of the battlefield, which is in Mariupol. And here we get reports now of more and more evacuations of civilians from the Azovstal factory. Now, the Russians, when they first got the news that there were civilians at the Azovstal factory, were openly skeptical, but they seem to have finally come round to accepting that there were civilians indeed in the bunkers under the Azovstal factory. They made various offers for these civilians to be evacuated. The Ukrainians turned down all of those offers. It's clear that what has eventually happened is that the Russians, looking for ways to get these civilians out of the Azovstal factory, turned to the United Nations. That appears to have been the reason why Guterres, the UN Secretary General, went to Moscow a week ago, with the result that the UN agencies and the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, seem to have taken charge of the evacuation. Now, the Ukrainians, who up to this point have been most unwilling to allow the civilians to leave Mariupol, appear to have felt that they had no real option but to agree to the evacuation of these civilians under the auspices of the UN and of the Red Cross. And though we are not seeing all of these civilians leave at one go, dribbles of them are now coming out at a steady rate, and the probability is that over the next few days, all of them, or at least most of them, will have left. That will leave the Ukrainian troops who are in the Azovstal factory still there. And there are now reports, and I'm not going to, I've heard about these reports floating around for a long time, but there are now reports that there is a senior officer, or at least a senior retired officer from a NATO military, who is in the Azovstal factory. Some claim that he has a general's rank. Some people say there were earlier reports that he was American, which I didn't think were particularly secure. Latest reports suggest that he's Canadian. Whether this person exists, I don't know. Apparently, he's not a serving officer of any NATO military. If he does exist, he's a retired officer, but he does seem to be there at the Azovstal factory. At least most of the reports seem to say that. And apparently some Ukrainian reports, which I haven't seen, confirm his presence. And apparently he has been on the phone to no less a person than Zelensky himself. Again, I'm getting this from various reports which cite Ukrainian sources, which I have not seen and verified for myself. Now, that presumably in part explains all those desperate attempts that the Ukrainians were making a few weeks ago to evacuate people from Azovstal, evacuation attempts which resulted in the Ukrainians suffering heavy losses of helicopters and ships, cargo ships. It seems that likely that the person that they were trying to evacuate was this NATO official or former NATO official, and presumably whatever team is there with him. The Russians are implacable as far as they are concerned. He must surrender. If he's there at all, he must surrender with all of the other Ukrainian troops who are in Azovstal. So this seems to be the Russian position. the civilians can leave under the auspices of the Red Cross and the UN. The military, the Ukrainian military in Azovstal must stay, and they must surrender, or if they don't surrender, they must eventually die, because reports are coming again that food supplies are now short, though presumably getting rid of all of these civilians will mean that there's more food for the soldiers to share amongst each other, because they won't have to share it with the civilians any longer. But anyway, there are finite supplies of food, and sooner or later, anyway, these troops trapped in the Azovstal factory, facing heavy shelling, facing heavy bombing, will either die, or, as I think much more likely, they will eventually do that which many of their comrades in Mariupol have already done, which is surrender. Anyway, we will see how this all works out, but my own sense is that we are now very much at the end game where Mariupol is concerned. Now, on the topic of Mariupol and the Azovstal, before I finally leave this topic in this program, I'm going to make one further point about Western media coverage of what's been happening in Azovstal and in Mariupol. Because, of course, the Russians claim that these civilians who were in the bunkers underneath the Azovstal factory were essentially hostages held by the Ukrainian troops there in order to prevent a direct Russian assault upon them. Human shields, as the Russians like to call them. Now, this is obviously a Russian point of view. Ukrainians would say otherwise, and it does seem to me as if at least some of these civilians are family of some of the Ukrainian soldiers trapped in Azovstal. So it's plausible, or so it seems to me, that some of these civilians chose to go there voluntarily, even though perhaps they would have regretted doing so. But anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. Now, I have absolutely no doubt at all that in an analogous situation, if, for example, we were to get into a situation in the Middle East where a jihadi organization that the United States and Britain and the other Western countries were fighting were to also hold out in a particular town or village or factory or some such place, and were to keep civilians there, that the Western media, the Western governments would be saying exactly the same thing. They would be talking about hostages, they would be talking about human shields, they would be doing so to a much greater and noisier extent than the Russians have been doing about the civilians in Azovstal. Now, of course, no one in the West is saying this. They're not describing these people in those terms because, of course, they're Ukrainians and they're with Ukrainian troops in the factory. And, of course, we don't talk in that way about what the Ukrainians do, even though, as I said, I have no doubt at all that in a comparable situation, say in the Middle East, if Western troops were confronted with the same problems that the Russians have been facing at the Azovstal factory, Western troops, Western governments, Western media would be making identical complaints to the Russians. And this is perhaps another reason to be very careful of what you read in the media in the West. And of course, it isn't just the media in the West. Now, over the course of my program yesterday, I discussed at length comparisons between, or similarities, some of which I find very disturbing, between the war in Ukraine, the US response to the war in Ukraine, and the US response in the 1960s to the war in Vietnam. I said that the US appeared to be making very similar decisions in the face of this war in Ukraine to the decisions the US made during the war in Vietnam in the 1960s. In fact, the parallels seem to me extremely uncomfortable. And I pointed out that the mistakes, the decisions that were made by the US over Vietnam in the 1960s eventually proved disastrous, and I'm sure that they would prove similarly disastrous if they were applied in Ukraine, if they were seen to in Ukraine. And there is one similarity which I have noticed, and it is a concerning one to me, and which this is that we are now getting, just as we got in Vietnam, endless numbers of figures from Western governments about Russian losses in Ukraine. Now, none of these come from any Russian source. Some of them, I suspect, come from Ukrainian sources. But we are getting body count figures from the Western governments, and I think that they are wildly inflated. Now, those of us who remember the Vietnam War, which I just about do, will remember that there was the same practice of giving body count numbers for the number of dead North Vietnamese or Viet Cong over the course of the Vietnam War. And we were also reading reports all the time about how the Vietnamese were running out of men, running out of weapon systems, that they were about to fail, that they would not be able to continue the war for very much longer. And we got all of this being recycled week after week, month after month, that Vietnam's capacity to sustain the war was close to coming to an end. And those predictions were wrong at the time, and with more information that's come out about actual Vietnamese losses during the war, we now know how profoundly wrong they are. So it is disturbing to see the same pattern now about Ukraine. We now have this figure of 15,000 dead Russian troops. I've already said that actually this has remained relatively static since March, but this seems to be the figure that people are now coming up with. The British Defence Ministry, which is particularly bad in this respect, now says that around a third of Russian military formations in Ukraine have been degraded, whatever that means. They also say that, and we've also received reports, that the Russians are about to run out of their long-range missiles, and that they won't be able to sustain their air campaign for very much longer. I have to say, I don't believe a word of it. I mean, I don't know what the basis for these assessments and these figures are. I would say that I look at many sites, I look at Ukrainian sites too. I've seen any number of really distressing pictures of dead Ukrainians, dead Ukrainian soldiers, dead Ukrainian armor. The numbers seem to me already harrowing. I see nothing comparable to in terms of dead Russians or dead Russian equipment. Now, again, the right place to look for all of this, you want an English language website that does this extremely well, again, is Jacob Dryson's Dryson Report. He goes into all of this in great detail, and he's able to assess some of these photographs in ways that I can't do. And in some cases, he's pointed out that pictures of dead Russians and destroyed tanks, which are attributed to, which are sometimes spread around as proof of Russian losses, are actually, in truth, dead Ukrainians and destroyed Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles. You have to go to the Dryson Report to see all this sort of thing being done for yourself. But anyway, the point is that the cumulative effect of this misunderstanding, these exaggerated numbers, because I am sure they are exaggerated, about Russian losses, to the extent that they're being spread in the West, I suspect are beginning to cause further distortions and misconceptions about the extent to which the Russians can sustain the war. I've been following commentaries by Russian officials senior Russian officials, and they come across to me as confident and calm. They don't come across to me as minded to believe, as they would presumably do, if these inflated figures of Russian losses were true. Now, in saying all of this, I want to say that the Russians, no doubt, are to some extent guilty of this also. As several people have pointed out, the Russians are now claiming that they've destroyed more tanks and armoured vehicles possessed by Ukraine than the Ukrainian military fielded at the start of the war. And it is highly likely that the Russians have been inflating the figures for the numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles that they've destroyed. I would add a word of caution, because if you actually look at the actual report, which was provided by General Rudskoi on the 25th of March, in which General Rudskoi actually gave a number for the tanks and armoured vehicles that the Ukrainians possessed in their military at the start of the war, he did seem to be suggesting that this number, around 2,400, was the tanks and armoured vehicles actually in use by the Ukrainian military. It seems to me, say that this was the totality of tanks and armoured vehicles possessed by Ukraine. And he suggests the way it looked to me, for example, is that he was not counting tanks and armoured vehicles possessed by Ukraine in its reserve stocks, in other words, in warehouses and such places. And I've actually heard estimates that the true number of tanks, armoured vehicles and whatever possessed by Ukraine, not just in the serving military but in warehouses, was actually closer to 3,500 as opposed to 2,400, in which case the Russians have destroyed not more than those that the Ukrainians possessed, but rather 2/3 of them. But, having said that, there is some explaining to do, and I'm perfectly willing to believe that the Russians are inflating their numbers, the numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles and other things that they have destroyed. I would, however, again, make two cautionary points. The fact is that there is now growing film and photographic evidence that Ukrainian troops are increasingly having to use civilian vehicles to move around the battlefield, which does appear to confirm that they are running increasingly short of tanks and armoured vehicles. And the second point, which has been made by the invaluable Scott Ritter in another of his extremely interesting and important articles about the war, is that the very fact that Ukraine has been hawking around Western capitals, trying to get Western governments to supply it with tanks and armoured vehicles, is in itself an admission that Ukraine is now desperately short of both. And in fact, we were getting reports only a short time ago that the Pentagon itself was becoming increasingly alarmed at the extent to which Ukraine was running short of ammunition and of weapon systems. So it may be that the Russians are inflating the numbers of armoured vehicles that they're destroying, and the number of Ukrainian weapon systems that they are destroying. But as I said before, one does get the sense overall that their numbers, if perhaps somewhat inflated, are within an approximate range of the truth. One thing the Russians have not been doing is providing regular body counts. They don't provide much information about their own losses, except that General Rudskoi back on the 25th of March said that they'd lost 1,300 men killed, and they've never provided more information since then. That was, of course, already a fraction of the number that the West was claiming, and for what it's worth, as of the 25th of March, I believe that figure is true. But the Russians have not provided updates on that figure, and they've not provided regular updates and body counts of Ukrainian losses, except, of course, that they do say that every day they killed several hundreds of Ukrainian troops in airstrikes and whatever, figures that we can't verify. But they've been careful not to provide total numbers. So it's perhaps another indication that Russian numbers are a little more reliable than ours. And of course, the Russians are fighting the war. And I also get the sense that they must be keeping reasonably accurate figures for the numbers of dead Ukrainians that they find on the actual field of battle. So when they say that, 120 people were killed in an airstrike here, or 130 people were killed in a shelling attack there, perhaps they have some basis to know. But, saying that, no doubt the Russians are engaging in inflation as well. But at least I get the sense that overall their figures are roughly right. The last ballpark number they gave for the total number of Ukrainian losses was 23,000, and that was given about 10 days ago, and it did seem to me about right in terms of the numbers of Ukrainian soldiers killed in the battle. I think that we need to stop focusing so much in the West on body counts. I think body counts have been repeatedly shown to be deeply misleading. They're also macabre, and I think that they're giving a very wrong impression of the state of the battle. Certainly when it comes to missile attacks that the Russians are launching, there's no sign of any slackening of the effort at all, which does beg the question of why people still think that the Russians are running out of missiles. They've been making that prediction since early March, and the Russian missile attacks have, if anything, grown in intensity. So I don't see why people believe that these numbers are accurate today. Anyway, I would advise people to steer away from body counts, and I would certainly say that body counts provided by the West are profoundly unreliable. Body counts provided by Ukrainians are, in my opinion, straightforwardly fictitious. Russian accounts of body counts are perhaps more reliable, or at least marginally more reliable, but it's highly likely that inflation takes place there too, and they should be taken with a major pinch of salt. So that's all I wanted to say about this. But anyway, moving on, there's also now it's becoming increasingly clear that the European Union is getting itself into a hideous tangle over Russian energy exports to the European Union. As predicted, the German government, Robert Habeck, the German economics minister, is now essentially supporting an oil embargo. He wants to stop all purchases by the European Union of Russian oil as of the end of this year. Also, he says, some European countries, Hungary in particular, are pushing back on this. These are not just Hungary, but apparently Slovakia, other countries as well. The Hungarians are even talking about vetoing energy sanctions. We shall see whether or not they're able to stick to that position. But clearly there is now a real argument about this, and we'll see what decision is finally made. I would make one observation, which is that, again, I ask myself this basic question. Why is the European Commission involved in this at all? if a country like Germany wants to stop importing Russian oil, well, that's their decision. One might think that's a good decision, one might think it's a bad decision, but that's something that they can decide to do for themselves. Why is the Commission in Brussels now interfering in basic economic decision making in all EU member states, to the extent that it is now telling the Hungarians and the Slovaks and others what oil they should import from where? That seems to me an extraordinary expansion, again, of the power of the Commission over the member states. Now, it's using this device of sanctions in order to do it. But consider again that quite apart from any visceral antagonism the EU might have towards Russia and the EU Commission might have towards Russia, what is taking place here is an extraordinary and remarkable power grab in which the European Commission, through the instrument of sanctions, is now directly interfering in basic, fundamental forms of economic activity, which up to now have always been understood to be the responsibility of the member states. But there we are. For the record, I think an EU embargo on Russian oil is now only a matter of time. I think that the extent to which the Hungarians, the Slovaks, and all the others can resist this, given the pressure they're going to come under from the Germans, the Italians, the French, to some extent the Spanish, eventually, obviously the Poles as well. I question whether these relatively small countries can hold out for very long. But anyway, the fact that there is an argument about this is indicative in and of itself. But in some respects, the oil embargo issue is for me overshadowed by the extraordinary duplicity that is going on over the gas trades, because the European Commission has been telling all the European governments not to agree to Putin's gas for ruble scheme, and yet, according to the Hungarians, at least 10 European countries are now conforming to it, even though they're very reluctant to say so in public. And not only that, but it's also clear that countries like Poland are getting gas from countries that are buying Russian gas and paying for it in rubles. So what is in fact happening is that the Poles are benefiting, are getting gas which is paid for by rubles, only they are not paying the rubles, others are doing it for them. Now, this shows, to my mind, the total illogicality of this process. In the meantime, the Russians, who don't have to engage in these elaborate fictions, are pressing ahead. They're selling more gas to China. Apparently, sales of gas to China have increased by 60% this month. The Russians are now supplying more coal to China and India. They're now working hard to develop a major trade deal with India to supply India with oil. So the Russians are moving forward. They're also going to be supplying apparently Indonesia with oil. Something of a surprise given that Indonesia has historically been an oil producer, but no doubt there's explanations for this which I'm not familiar with. But anyway, we see how the Russians are responding to these pressures, these energy pressures. We see how the Europeans are making increasingly illogical economic decisions, which are putting their positions and the positions of their economies in ever greater jeopardy. I wonder how much longer this can go on for, and what amount of damage is going to be done in the meantime. I still believe that we are now heading for a angry, complete economic divorce. But nobody should be under any illusions about the economic cost. And in the meantime, the damage done in terms of trust, in terms of plain speaking, not that we've ever had much of that in Europe, at least not for some time, well, all of that is incalculable. Well, on this, I'm going to end this program. Hopefully, with the holidays out of the way, I'll be able to provide a more detailed update of the situation shortly. Though I would say that Russia is in a major holiday period. In a couple of days' time, the Russians also celebrate Victory Day over Nazi Germany. So that's on the 9th of May. That's going to be obviously an emotional holiday. It always is, but it's going to be even more emotional given the extent to which Russia is currently at war. And we'll see how the Russians celebrate that holiday and what approach they take to it. So more from me soon. And in the meantime, remember, you can find us on Locals and Rumble. If you are watching this video on Rumble, if you go to the top of the video, you'll see a red maroon button. If you press it, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, in which case you can join our community there, publish your own exclusive content on our homepage, our Locals homepage, and also participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place exclusively on Locals. And of course, we're also on multiple other platforms. You can find us, for example, on SuperU, on ODYSEE, and on others. And you can also support us if you wish via our shop by buying the amazing things that you will find there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, and all those things. And also via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Lastly, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.